Welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the city of demons. That's right, not city of angels, city of demons, especially these days. Or like I like to say, Hollyweird or La La Land, or even Weird California. As you already know, we are broadcasting on 107.7 FM UPRN, New Orleans, Louisiana, as well as iHeartRadio, Deprogrammed Radio in the UK, and all sorts of outlets. Today is another historic show with a great friend of mine and a great mentor, the one and only Preston Dennett. Preston, welcome back.
Hey, thanks, Dr. J.
Well, real quick, because I put Contact in the Desert in the title, how was it?
Oh, amazing. That was my first time, and it was everything I thought it would be and more. There was so many people. A lot of amazing researchers were there. Got to hook up with Whitley Strieber, Yvonne Smith, Barbara Lamb. Travis Walton was there. Linda Moulton Howe. It was amazing.
Richard Dolan, Eric Von Doniken, right?
Yep. The list is endless.
Yeah, 3 days. As a matter of fact, it still kept going on even until yesterday.
Yeah, I did two presentations kind of back to back, one on healing power of UFOs and another on the UFO or USO activity here off the coast.
Well, this is actually great because, as I told you earlier, yesterday, when I interviewed Linda Godfrey, we got into USOs, and I mentioned that today I had the man, the international expert on USOs. So the fact that you actually did a presentation on that, and I should also say this for the audience that I just found out, and I even wrote it in chat, that you have a new book, which is what the title of your other presentation is, Healing Powers of UFOs. And of course, I put other stuff in the title that I'd love to talk about too. But first, let's go into just for other people who don't know what USO is, identify it.
A USO is very much like a UFO, but you just can't call it a UFO because it's not flying. It's swimming. It's submerged. So we use the term USO.
But the moment it comes out of the water, though, it becomes a UFO, right?
Yeah, these objects can fly in and out of the water. And for that matter, there are a number of cases where these things go into land. Just, you know what I mean?
Did I ever tell you? You know what? This is going to be my first, actually, and I don't want to be casual, but I might as well tell people about this. Did I ever tell you about this crazy experience I had off Malibu with a probable USO?
Yeah, we've talked about it a little bit, and I've never buckled you down and did the formal interview.
Here, I'll just tell you real quick. I was swimming, and this was in October. Like I was, boogie boarding, right? And bodyboarding. And so there wasn't really much activity in the ocean. And something just got my attention. And I thought it was like a soccer ball, just bobbing. But all of a sudden, it was more like black, like the surface of I don't know, a sea lion or something like that. And it just started gliding along the ocean, really small, towards me, and it scared the crap out of me. So I started, going back towards the shore because it was headed my direction. Really wasn't that big, and the thing that got me the most is as it was going over the ocean, it really had no ripples behind it. It didn't look like a boat or anything for that matter as it's going over the ocean, at the surface of it, and the speed of it. I couldn't imagine how something can go that fast. When I got to the shore, I looked up. There's a drone, I'm like, okay, well, where's the kid with the drone controller? And literally that drone followed that thing because that thing just took off into the ocean and, went further south down the coastline. And I just disappeared. And that really was the first time that I could say I honestly saw something that was truly unidentified, that I don't know if that was the tip of the spear or if that was by itself, but it absolutely had power because it did come towards me very fast and then go in another direction. And it also stopped too. And we also know that in Malibu, Preston, you've done lectures about this, the underground base there.
Right. It's funny because I charted all the cases I've got, which is, 150 or so, and put them all on a map, and it stretches the entire distance of the Santa Catalina Channel there, from Santa Barbara about all the way south through Malibu, Santa Monica, Palos Verdes, all the way to literally San Clemente, a good stretch of water there. But it was really thick right there at Malibu. That's where it's thickest. And lo and behold, there's that, Malibu anomaly, which I was pretty much predicted was going to be there, in that general area.
Based on the data, right, from all the accounts that you've had over the years, right?
Exactly. I'm like, I think there's a base down here, and this is way before that all those images came out. And
remember that this was years ago. You were investigating, and I thought this was one of the most groundbreaking cases, where you had one of the Boy Scouts come over to your house with his parents and was talking about the weekend on Catalina Island, what they saw.
Right. That was another kind of turning point for me in learning about this area, because I had collected a number of cases, but there was a rare type of case which involved, not 10 or 20 objects, but more than that, 30, 40, 50, 100, or 200. And I had already had like 2 or 3 cases with those number of objects when this one came along, and it involved 200 objects. I'm like, where are all these objects coming from? And yeah, that guy was a great witness. Drew out exactly what he'd seen. It was an encounter that lasted just about 2 hours, multiple witnesses, really amazing.
I remember the different craft he described and drew. Like you said, the classic disc shape, the triangle, the rectangle, the sphere. And didn't he mention that one of the triangles was having trouble with repulsion and was surrounded, or not surrounded, had another craft on either side of it? It was trying to go up and down.
Yeah, he described all these different things. It all began, the big fog rolled over the island, and then it lifted, and they saw these 3 bright, looked like planets kind of, or, orbs up there in the sky, star-like objects. When one of them started to shiver and shake and flash bright, and suddenly all these UFOs appeared, a group of like 10, maybe 20. Now, this is so interesting to me because this is exactly what the other witnesses are describing. And he describes how this happened multiple times, and some of these craft came real close, and you could see the little canopy on top, and they had multicolored lights, these things, purple, yellow, green, red, orange. They were really beautiful, he said, and just wave after wave after wave, till at one point they were, there was a bunch of witnesses there. They couldn't watch them even among, a group of witnesses. There were so many. Of course, they tried to take pictures, and in the 2 cases that I know of, each time the camera battery died completely. Came back afterwards, by the way.
Let me ask you this, because I've noticed this anomaly. This actually happens more with digital cameras as opposed to the old analog cameras with just regular film. I've noticed that people using electronic cameras to record something nearby, you just aren't going to get it like you did, say, in the 50s or 60s.
Yeah, I got another case right there on Catalina Island where a group of 11 people had a very close encounter, and they were, professional photographers up there. They had cameras, several of them. There was at least 3 or 4 people who had cameras, and all tried to take pictures of these things that were coming down, and not one of the cameras worked.
And this goes back to years of what people have been talking about, engines been stalling and other things like that. So it just sort of fits in line. I would sort of expect that this is the same reason why cars shut down when objects fly overhead.
Yeah, there's very strange aspects to a lot of these things. I think that is purposeful. I think they're putting a ray down. I don't think it's just them flying by and the camera doesn't work. I think this is speculation, of course, but it's just based on the fact that there are so many cases when a UFO appears and the camera doesn't work. And with this Boy Scout, there were other weird effects. He was, watching all these UFOs, and when they looked towards the coastline, which, mind you, is, a minimum of 26 miles away, it looked close up. It was magnified.
Really?
Yes, it's a very strange effect, which I've only heard a few times. And it was so close you could see the individual cars on the road, the buildings. They saw this lighthouse, which turned out to be fortunate. They ended up identifying it, and it was, God, I forget how many miles away. It was like 30 or 40, I forget. But they think that's the lighthouse they saw very close up. So, and it was so strange because suddenly, this whole incident just ends. All the objects just split away. Those 3 things in the sky are gone. And they turn and they look at the shore, and it's back to normal.
Now, this sort of reminds me of something that Bob Lazar said, and that underneath the craft, when you're looking straight up at it, you really can't see it because the way the gravity envelops the craft, it's bending the light. And I'm wondering if that is the reason why, with all this activity up there, the shore looked like it was closer.
I've thought about this quite a bit, and gosh, I just can't quite make sense of it. Another theory I have is that they come through a portal, and so that's where the portal is, and it's bending, time-space to some extent. Yeah, but there was a lot of these objects. Maybe that had something to do with it as well.
That's true. That is true. And you know what? The fact that you mentioned about the portal, that's something that I always say, if Bob Lazar, first of all, I remember I was at your house and I was telling you that one thing Bob Lazar said is he actually made me believe more in Billy Meyer, because when George Knapp had asked him if he had ever seen any footage that looked like the sports model, Bob Lazar said, that guy, Billy Meyer, either if you see one of the videos that looks like a sport model, he goes, either that guy is telling the truth or he knew exactly what was going on at S4 and was able to hoax it. And he goes, by the way, I didn't think he was hoaxing it. And so that right there really started me to open up more that Bob is telling the truth. I've always believed Bob Lazar, and the fact that he's never changed the story. But also the fact that he talks about that if you're able to use make an artificial gravity wave, by definition, what you're doing is you are not just a spacecraft, or not just traveling fast. What you're doing is you are creating a wormhole. You're bending space-time, and by definition, you have time travel, you have force fields, you have cloaking ability. All these things become a possibility if you are able to create artificial gravity.
Right, which we apparently have, or we at least have it in our possession. So can you imagine how we're going to, roll that out into mainstream society? That's the whole, I think, one of the obstacles behind this cover-up that we're, paralyzed by.
Some people say, though, is that we're actually going through a soft disclosure. And if you look at the 80s, when everyone I thought that was the coolest, the pinnacle of our technology. But now, we look at the 80s and you're like, that was crap compared to the technology we have now. And if you think about what Philip Corso said in The Day After Roswell, of all this technology that was seeded into civilian hands and into the military, which trickled down to us, we might be using right now the technology is made on Earth, but originally the technology was designed from somewhere else, and we just sort of copied it. And that's what he basically said in The Day After Roswell.
Right. Well, I mean, if you look at what people describe that inside UFOs, what does the inside of a UFO look like? Well, we get very similar descriptions, of course, the rounded rooms with the indirect lighting, but we also get TV screens. So I'm guessing they had them way before we did.
Yeah, flat screens too. I mean? That's right. And flat, yeah.
And they also have these sort of holographic X-ray devices which show the inside of your body in full living color. They've got all kinds of sensing devices, which is very much like what we're slowly beginning to develop, and probably already have. In fact, speaking of, the inside of UFOs, there's a very strong medical theme that runs through them. The first thing people describe as being physically examined. And there's all these instruments. The aliens are very interested in our body.
Anatomy, yeah.
Right, they have healing technology. Well, assuming that crash retrievals are a true phenomena, and I'm convinced they are.
Me too.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not 5 or 10 cases by any means. It's 5 or 10 cases per state.
Which would make it, 250 up to 500 per state if you add that total up, bro, with the 50 states. Like you said, right. Just the U.S.
And mind you, this is just coming from a small scattering of witnesses who have been brave enough to speak out. I'm guessing it's a lot more than that, because this has been effectively covered up, particularly the crash retrievals. But if these crash retrievals are true, then we have this technology. And going back to this medical theme that runs through onboard accounts, it's a lot of healing technology aboard those craft. Lasers that can heal cuts, broken bones, all kinds of stuff like this. And now we do have whistleblowers coming out saying that, yep, we do have it, and it is being used on a very limited basis by these people who are, covering it up.
And you know why I would think limited, because there goes the pharmaceutical and the medical industry. That was one thing that Richard Doty, when I was able to interview him, and he said he could talk about UFOs, but he can't talk about any technology that would have to do with medicine, and sort of inferred the reason why is because of it would ruin the medicine industry, the whole medical industry.
It's going to go one of two ways. Either we're going to come together and unite with all humanity in love, which is idealistic, or they're going to have to shift this over to the pharmaceutical industry. They don't have to worry. People will pay to be healed by alien technology. So they're just going to have to shift it over, if you know what I mean, because they already have control of it.
Now, because you've been talking about doing a book on the healing cases and even saving cases, let me throw that in there, because I remember a case that you told me about where I believe it was a woman that was on a boat that it was, I don't know what happened. Maybe the boat was in the ocean, there was a storm or something, but the aliens brought her to shore, right?
Right. There's a chapter in the book on people who've been rescued by ETs.
Rescued. There we go.
And it's completely amazed me because I knew that there were, a few cases, but there's a case of like someone who had a refrigerator fall on them and a ET showed up and lifted it up. Another lady who had a motorcycle accident, I interviewed her and she had two grays show up and she was fine, but she was, stuck on a remote mountain road in the middle of the night. And they fixed the motorcycle because she wasn't able to start it. And they put the Kickstarter back into shape. Steps back and she jumps on the motorcycle and takes off. Another guy, he's driving along, everything's fine. A UFO appears in front of him on the road and shines a beam of light right in front of him on the road. And there's a mattress there.
Ha! Just to stop his fall or to make sure he lands okay? Wow.
Yeah, he had time to swerve around it. There's three kids that are driving through the desert in Las Vegas area and get caught in the sand, and it's overnight. And they're thinking, well, what are we going to do? We'll have to walk out in the morning, but they're pretty far out there when a UFO shows up and lifts their pickup up and puts it on the road. And before you say, that's impossible, because that's a really, that's a crazy story. Car lift cases are absolutely a thing with this phenomena. They do it all the time.
And I always thought that the universal law would be not to interfere with us unless they've made some sort of mistake and caused some harm. And in that case, then they would have to sort of fix us as opposed to let us die because of them. What I'm thinking of is Travis Walton, how he's changed from just being abducted to actually saying that it was more of an ambulance case, that he was abducted and he was harmed by getting in front of this craft and the propulsion, and they abducted him or brought him on board to repair him and bring him back.
Right. I totally, ETs are not here to harm us. We're related to them in some way. They're very interested in everything human. There aren't a lot of cases of or really any, of sadism or torture or mass murder or things like this. There are a lot of missing people, and that's a concern. We don't know exactly what's happened to them. And this is definitely a dark side to this phenomena. Some people do come away medically damaged. They're severely traumatized. Boy, I was talking to Terry Lovelace. He had a hell of a story, which wasn't pleasant.
Ooh, I haven't heard that case at all.
Yeah, he's got a book out right now. It's doing really well on Amazon. And he's a guy who, had abductions from a very young age. Where these figures would come into his room. They use the screen memory, get this, of little monkeys. Which, they always come up with something, don't they? Clowns, stuffed animals, superheroes. It's
anything
amazing.
to reduce fear.
Right, which it's not super effective. because what it sort of does is transfer fear to that figure. That's why there's a huge, clown phobia in our society, I think.
There is, absolutely, and I believe that's probably the case because, if you look at a kid's, toys in the 50s, it was, a stuffed bear and a clown of some sort, or clown-themed rooms and things like that. If those things start to come to life, then all of a sudden, that's where it came from. Stephen King's It. I think the inspiration for having this killer clown, and even, there's a lot of videos out there on YouTube about killer clowns. I'm sure a lot of them are just hoaxes and this and that, but the phobia, like you said, actually comes from the fact that some of these were animated, and inanimate objects becoming animate is something that's always something that I've always took an interest in, because how can something inanimate all of a sudden be animate, unless of course it's a screen memory.
Right. So it's definitely a clue there. But in regards to Terry Lovelace, you might want to consider having him on the show, because he's got a real story. I don't want to tell his whole story, but it's interesting because he was in the military, and I think he's part of this whole military alien project. And there was definitely evidence of them working together. And yeah, it's quite a story. It's
I'm definitely going to have to track him down. That's for darn sure. Now, your most recent book, your 23rd book, and now 23rd on UFOs, right? Or just include in total?
In total, I've written a bunch on the paranormal. I think it's my 15th or 16th on UFOs.
Now, how many cases have you written about in that book?
This book covers over 300 cases.
Wow.
And that's honestly just the tip of the iceberg. I'm still hearing about more cases. And you know how 1 person in 100 really reports their encounter, but especially if it's something like that, major. You see an entity or missing time or what have you, as opposed to a sighting. Most people don't report it. So those 300 cases, you can times that by 10 easy.
Or more, more than that, yeah. I would think, because see, now that the book is out, Preston, I think people are going to start coming to you with more of their stories and say, you know what, this happened to me too, after they read it.
Right. Well, there have been studies to find out how common this was, and I pretty much surveyed all the major researchers, cornered Bud Hopkins because he, was the leading guy, and he never wrote a word about these types of cases. And I'm like, well, have you heard of them? And he's like, oh, yeah, we get them, but it's pretty rare. And that's what David Jacobs said. But John Mack's like, well, I got more than a few. And Edith Fiore, PhD, she's like, well, me, 50% of my cases involve healings. Barbara Lamb has a lot. Yvonne Smith has a couple. Tim Beckley, a number of them. All the major researchers I found, Cynthia Hind, just goes on and on. Brad Steiger, they all have healing cases. So it's not uncommon. I certainly came up with a bunch. And that's how I got started. I knew a lady who had a healing. And I think it's probably, the free organizations had 50%. I was part of that study. And I'm going to still reduce it down to closer to 20.
That's 1 in 20 people, you mean?
Yeah, 120. It's hard to, the percentage among contact cases.
Now, in your book of Healing Powers of UFO, you said it started with you interviewing a lady, I'm assuming, who had, of course, was healed. Can you tell us about that case?
Yeah, it's what really got me intrigued. This is an amazing lady who I went to see the Crystal Skull, Max the Crystal Skull, and she was there. So I sat next to her and we got to talking, and it turned out she's had a number of UFO experiences. She had witnesses to support her story. And so I started interviewing her. And she had this amazing story where she had actually 2 separate healings. The first one she told me was she had a cyst in her fallopian tubes. And it was causing her all kinds of problems. It was painful. And she went to the doctor and it was diagnosed. And there was the MRIs, the X-rays, the whole deal. She had surgery set up, and it's literally like the day before surgery. And this happens in case after case. It's so strange. I call it the last-minute phenomena. She has an experience. And some people, they have it on the way to the hospital or even in the hospital on the way to surgery. But she had hers, like many of these people, on the day before surgery. doesn't really remember what happened. She just had a very restless night and knew they, quote, had come. And goes to the doctor. The doctor's pretty upset. And he's like, well, we can't find your cyst. Your cyst is gone. She's like, really? She's knowing what happened, right? And he says, yes, you went and had surgery. And she's like, well, no, I didn't. He says, well, don't lie to me. We know you did. She says, no, I didn't. And he showed her the MRI, and there's this fluid here in the fallopian tubes, which is only present after surgery has been done. So we know you did. And furthermore, they pointed to this laser scar on her abdomen. They're like, what's that? And she says, I don't know. I don't know what that is.
You mentioned that laser scar. Let me mention that actually rings really interesting to me, because laser cutting tools, and I've always put that together with their technology. That I would think that's the way they would use instead of a scalpel to cut us open.
Yeah, they don't use scalpels. I don't have. See, they do use syringes, needles, but mostly it's lights and other sort of metallic objects or sort of ceramic looking, and they set them on the person's body and they'll pulse energy. They don't sometimes use sound, but yeah, generally, and for that matter, and I find this really interesting, a good 10% of the cases that I documented involved mind power, hands-on healing, no instruments.
You're talking about literally the ETs themselves are just essentially just looking at them and they just get healed?
Yeah, well, I mean, here's a good case. Michael Carter. He's an amazing guy, a black man who has fought against racism to such a degree that he got commended by President Clinton. A really amazing guy. He's written a number of books, has had encounters with Greys, and developed, at some point, he's living down in North Carolina, there with his family, develops a blood clot in his leg. It swells up pretty quick. He goes to the doctor, 2 days too late, because by that time, his leg is twice its normal size, and he can barely walk. He can't. Doctor is horrified and says, oh my God, you should have come in days earlier. Puts him on a really rigid regimen of blood thinning drugs and so on, and sends him home to sort of recover. And he's going for regular checkups every week or so. I forget what it was. And right before one of his checkups, he's going. He had just gone to the doctor and had just started treatment. He wakes up in the middle of the night. He's sleeping on his back, and he looks up, and there's this Nordic being, very tall, blonde, long hair, wearing a robe, beautiful, very handsome, very muscular, and holds his right hand out, palm forward, and out comes a blue beam of light, which strikes him on the head and chest. For just a moment, that's all he really remembers, and falls asleep. Wakes up the next morning, instantly remembers this, of course, and is so excited, can't wait to tell his wife and kids, and rolls out of bed and looks down at his leg, and boom, it's normal. I mean, well, it's not completely normal. He says it looks like some of his arteries and veins and stuff had been rerouted.
Wow. Like almost like a graft in some sort of way too, or not a graft. There's a term for it where you sort of like, put them in a different direction. Like I've had a nerve, right, when it's going one direction, like, and you want to pull it around, say, a different bone. There's a term for it, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it was amazing, and he went to his doctor. And his doctor's like, "Oh my God, what happened? What happened? This is amazing." And Michael didn't want to say anything, and they usually don't. These, people who have been healed. He's just, "Can't you just be happy for me?" And the doctor was like very frustrated about it, but had no choice. I have 2 cases of people who were healed of blood clots in their leg. The other lady was actually abducted and treated with instruments. But it's amazing. There's how sometimes these doctors react. There's one guy, Jim Schaefer from Winnipeg, Canada, who has told his doctor his history because he kept coming home with puncture wounds and cuts and bruises. And one time he comes home, just wakes up, not comes home, I mean, wakes up in the morning because he's having experiences at night. and doesn't really remember them, but is starting to have nightmares and so on. And has had a lot of close-up UFO sightings, orbs coming to his house, and so on and so on. And one time woke up with his foot broken, goes to the doctor, and the doctor's like, "My God, I believe you. I think something is definitely happening to you." Well, he develops a cancerous cyst on his neck, which the doctor's like, said this has to go, and it grew very quickly. Even they scheduled surgery for 2 weeks, it was growing so much per day, and it was visible. He sent me his medical records, and what happened is he's getting ready for bed. It's about a week before surgery, and he's going through his house filming with his cell phone, looking for orbs because it had been happening a lot lately, and he's caught a bunch of them on camera. And he's getting ready for bed, and he's lying there in bed. It's filming when this orb shows up, and it comes swooping down and goes directly into his chest, which, hadn't happened before, and freaked him out certainly a little bit. He went to bed sometime later, woke up in the morning, and his tumor was gone. Goes to the doctor. The doctor's astounded and said, well, we still want to do surgery and check because you've got some tissue here that needs to be removed anyway. It's necrotic tissue. And they didn't find any cancer. They did not write in the medical book, healed by UFO. They put,
anomalous or something, right? Miraculous.
Miraculous healing or something they kind of alluded to it. Spontaneous healing or something like that. But they knew. Yeah, the doctor's like, yep, I totally believe you. And so that's a great case. I mean, he's got the medical records.
Let me ask you, this is something that I've always wondered when it comes with abductions and just abductees in general, and of course amongst those people who are healed. Have you ever heard of anyone who was plucked from a prison or any story like that? Because I would think it would happen if the population, if there's that many people being taken.
It's very interesting you should mention that because I did a study of precisely that. What I found is there are things that I call UFO attractors, like mines, metal mines. I could go on for an hour about that. Or graveyards, for whatever reason. Certainly we know about nuclear power stations. So yeah, these are UFO attractors, things that UFOs are attracted to.
Prisons because the populations, maybe?
I think it might be the building itself, because they're very definitely attracted to installations. But what I did find a lot of guards who've seen UFOs, then lots of cases of them hovering over prisons all across the United States and the world in dramatic fashion so that everyone could see them. But I did not find a single case of an abduction.
Well, that may be because, there might be a lot of lifers in there who have been taken and they may not want to talk about it, or someone who's a hardcore gangster and doing some hard time in prison comes out may not want to be talking about something like that because they would be thought they're crazy within their gang and then maybe get shanked or something like that down the road. I mean, that's what I would think would happen. But I've always argued, though, is that whenever we're seeing a craft or something hovering, it's always going to or coming from an abduction. What do you think about that?
Yes, that's something I've always said. One person's sighting is another person's abduction, or onboard experience is what I prefer to call them. And yeah, I mean, I sometimes wonder when there are waves of sightings, that might be different. But look at another thing that intrigues me is like the Phoenix Lights. Here's a mile-long craft. How filled up is that with people or entities?
Oh, jeez, I can't even imagine. Yeah, and Richard Shaw even mentioned in that video, that famous one from Turkey, that shows those two beings inside. What you actually see when he analyzed is there's a third one, and he made a comment that they must live like roaches. They're really packed in there. So when you're thinking of a mile wide, thousands, I would think absolutely thousands of them.
Oh, it's got to be more than that, because when you pack. That's a very big craft. You can pack a lot of people into a building. You know what I mean?
Stories too, levels, right?
Contact in the desert had 4,000 people at it, 3,000 or 4,000, and that's just a hotel. This thing was bigger than a hotel, so we're looking probably a good 100,000. I have no idea, but I can't imagine it's below 50 or 100,000 Grays or whoever's piloting it or humans. We don't know. There were very few reports of humanoids with that particular incident. I know there were a few scattered ones, but as far as I know, no one was taken aboard one of those big objects as it's flying over. But I do know of cases where people have been abducted inside the object, and they're looking down and seeing other people pointing and going, "Oh my God, a UFO! Look, look!"
Really? Really? That
Uh,
I wouldn't be surprised because you would think that would happen, but then it also brings the probability of the fact that how many people actually remember it. So if those people are remembering other people looking down, looking up, or yeah, looking up at them while they're above in a craft, that's what a small percentage of people that actually are remembering. Conscious recall.
yeah, conscious recall of onboard UFO experiences is tricky, I think, for a lot of people for a couple of reasons. It's an interdimensional experience, and like a dream or an out-of-body experience, it's difficult to bring that memory back. There's sort of a vibrational barrier. I think that's part of it. There's another sort of trauma response where people are like, I don't want to think about that, and I'm not going to. And if it's traumatic enough, your subconscious will shut it out and compartmentalize it. And thirdly, the ETs do have a strong agenda of amnesia upon witnesses for a couple of reasons. One, certainly to cover their tracks, and another, I think, to protect the witness from the trauma of the incident.
PTSD, easily. I would think so. And then that would be arguing that they are not here to cause harm for us. They're actually here to, for benevolent reasons.
Right. I flip-flop a little bit. After hearing Terry Lovelace, I'm like, gosh, my heart went out to him. He had some medical injuries and a lot of trauma, suffered from PTSD, and didn't know where it came from, which is certainly a thing among abductees. But yeah, the worst week I get, and certainly if you survey the literature and look at it pretty objectively, there aren't a lot of like super evil accounts where they torture people. There's a very small amount. There are some deadly encounters down in South America, Brazil area.
The human mutilations, right?
Right, and a number of deaths, certainly. But if you look at it from a sociological point of view, the ET behavior is precisely what we would do. They act like humans, except it's skewed slightly towards the positive. If we were going to survey an alien planet, certainly we would hover over their weapon systems. We'd want to see exactly how they got power. We want to look at all of this stuff.
What they're mining, right? How they're entrapping others in prisons.
Yeah, they're just surveying the entire planet. They are taking our precious metals, which is probably something we would do as well. But their behavior falls under the human umbrella, and they're healing people and they're hurting people. Some are good, some are bad. The vast majority, as far as I can tell, is somewhere in between. The Greys, in particular, can be a little unfeeling. There's a group of them, let me put it that way, who have a horrendous bedside manner and don't communicate well and don't seem to understand human emotion. But to some extent they do. There's one guy, Constance Clear, uncovered his case from Texas. He was having pretty horrendous abductions, didn't remember them, but was having nightmares, and under hypnosis recalled these pretty, unpleasant operations and medical-like experiments. And it went on and on. They did heal him twice, took off a mole, and also healed him of kidney stones. But at the end of all of his experiences, they're like, well, okay, we're done with you. Aren't you happy? And he says, no, I'm not happy. I'm mad as hell. And the female commander, who, by the way, told him that she's the highest ranking female on that ship, which I thought was interesting because that proves there's, human-like qualities to them. There's just Greys do have sexual discrimination in the workplace, apparently.
Wow, I never even thought of that.
But yeah, and she tells him, no, he says, I'm not happy. I'm mad as hell. And she says, well, what's mad and what's hell? And so he's like, oh my God. And
he's got to explain it, yeah.
So he explains it. And at the end of the explanation, she says, oh, well, we do have trouble with human emotions.
That's actually something interesting because I've heard that's one of the main reasons is that they're very curious about us is that we're able to show love and that the way we get angered or even on the bad side have hate, the way we're able to get to such extremes. I've heard that from other theories that they've developed so far down the line of evolution that they've sort of lost these qualities.
Right. I'm pretty much thinking these guys are very close to human. They probably have a genetic structure that's very similar to ours, given the fact that they are interbreeding with us. Though with their technology, they could probably overcome, interspecies breeding. But still, they behave in a way that looks like us. They look like us. They're hybridizing with us to form, hybrids that look very much human. Some of them. I definitely think that's one of their primary agendas.
I'm gonna take a look at some questions here because I feel bad. I don't want to, make sure. I want to make sure everyone gets their questions. That I feel bad that yesterday I didn't get to any of them. So I'm looking back here. I'm seeing. I hope I didn't miss too many from the first 30 minutes. If I did, anyone just please copy them and preferably put them in caps. This one I see already is from Nicholas Cashmore. What messages have these space people given to us?
It's a great question. The first thing out of their mouths, generally speaking, is don't be afraid, we won't hurt you, which, speaks to them not wanting to hurt people. I don't think that's their agenda at all. But when people get anything more than that, they're very evasive about where they come from. One lady asked, where are you from? And they said, we're from a place you don't know about yet. Another lady asked, and they said, it's not important. Another said, you wouldn't understand it. So they're pretty evasive about that. But when they do give messages, they fall into three main categories. And the first and most common by far, if they're given a message, will probably be some variation of warnings about environmental destruction. By that I mean use of nuclear power. They're very against that. Also pollution. Our warlike ways is mentioned quite a bit. They also literally warn people about hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes and so on.
Well, let me ask you this, because right now we're undergoing a severe. I think it's natural, by the way. I really don't think that people talk about climate change and that we are affecting it. I don't think there is so much to us as humans affecting it as much as it really is as being told in from, say, the media. I think maybe the human toll on this earth maybe add one more. So instead of having level 5 being the highest, they've had to add a level 6. Earthquakes. You've known this living in the valley close to me. We've never seen anything like this around the world where it's 9.0s or above. Yet we're seeing earthquakes in the 9s on the regular, almost every year, maybe twice a year. So I definitely think, what the hell's going on here? Are they trying to tell us that this is what's going to happen anyway, or to get us to get ready to maybe terraform on Mars or something like that? What do you think about that?
I think there's a lot going on, and Earth changes has been a theme from the beginning. Whether you look at the contactee era of the 1950s, which some researchers don't believe, I do. I think it was forced underground by an influx of greys who have the same message, as do the praying mantis in the Nordics, which are they're all the same. So I absolutely do think that it's no surprise that this is happening. And we could be up for some really difficult times. And I'm not sure that they're going to save us. But this talk of, mass extinctions is something that's been thrown around for decades. And these ETs have been warning us for almost 70 years now.
This is Frankie Zomboy. What about diseases like diabetes? Any reports on diseases? I'm thinking from them?
Sometimes, what's very common is people will see a UFO up close and they'll develop a migraine for a week. That turns up. There are a number of people who get too close to UFOs and suffer radiation sickness. Eye irritation is fairly common. These are just people who are, next to a UFO. Developing a disease from a UFO is pretty rare. It's usually the reverse. They cure it. And this can happen just by having a UFO fly over you, One guy had kidney stones. He's rushing to the hospital, and this UFO comes zooming around his car in this circular pattern, and his pain goes away, and they get to the hospital, gone. And kidney stones, no trace of him. Another guy, Prospect Park, New York City, Brandon Blackman, he's a columnist, is watching a UFO with a large group of people, and it flies off. He goes home and discovers a cut on his hand is completely cured.
You know, I would think, and also going back to the bubonic plague, if they wanted, say, to take over us and leave our infrastructure in place, the best way would be through biological warfare, introducing, say, a new disease. And when you think of the cases or the people that mentioned in, say, I don't know, the 1300s when the Black Plague was going on, the bubonic plague, at the end of villages, what were they seeing? They were seeing what we now would call a Grim Reaper, sort of waving Siths around with this green mist coming about. And, I've always wondered, is that the case? Was this disease introduced, in fact, by non-terrestrial beings?
I couldn't speak to that. I certainly studied the plague a little bit because my sister was really into it for whatever reason, maybe a past life or something. And she had a number of books on it. And it was a really incredible event for humanity. And goes to show how different, our history is amazing because we've never had a population like we have now. It's very large. There's this measles outbreak, and they're trying to contain it. There's a Ebola outbreak.
I was just going to say, they did a special on National Geographic about that, about when Ebola Zaire first broke out in, I believe, '89, and then it ends with this huge outbreak going on right now in 2019.
Right. Here's really interesting. I looked at, doing this UFO healing book. I'm like, well, gosh, what are the top 10 causes of death in the United States, and for that matter, the world? And the two lists agree pretty closely. They're not exact, but it's basically, heart disease, upper respiratory disease, cancer, accidents, and so on. And for example, what really shocked me is the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S. Was really sad. It's suicide. And experts think it's probably higher than that because some drug overdoses and accidents are probably suicide as well. And what I found after surveying all the ET healing cases is that ETs have healed every single condition of the top 10 causes of death.
So they've actually brought people back from the dead that have overdosed or hung themselves?
There are like 3 or 4 suicide cases. One guy was literally about to commit suicide, had a gun to his head, and a gray appeared.
Wow.
Another guy was completely suicidal and very sick, and wasn't like committing suicide at the time, but had a UFO strike him with a beam of light, and his suicide went away.
And the disease went away too?
Yep, absolutely. And there are other cases like this. The one lady, she's from, I believe it was Belgium or around there, Europe, and she described how she was chronically depressed and had this orb, large, almost basketball size, glowing orange, come in through the kitchen window, which was open, swirl around her in the kitchen and hit her in the chest and filled her with this golden light and cured her depression.
Here's a question from Kai Smith. Are they leaving it up to the government for disclosure? Good question.
The ETs...
Leaving it up to the government, yeah. Are they leaving it up to us?
Apparently, they're one front of it. They could end the cover-up right now. I think they're wiser than to do that. They don't want to disrupt society, and they don't want to have to take over. They're not healing everybody. Clearly, there's millions of people dying of heart disease and cancer and so on. I think the main operatives certainly are the so-called secret government, or the 1%ers who...
Cabal.
The quasi-military, right. MJ-12, whatever you want to call them. They're a very large splintered group, I would say, with many little tendrils all over the place into government. And I think they're absolutely have got a very tight control on this, but the ETs themselves are like, listen. And this, I think, might speak to why we're seeing some real movement here from the government. The Pentagon disclosures and pilots talking right now. I think the ETs are impatient and don't want to have to deal with a mass extinction or a society that's going to collapse, and are pushing disclosure for that reason so that they can have open official contact. And they're doing this in sort of a grassroots movement with events like the Phoenix Lights or the Topanga Canyon UFO wave or the Gulf Breeze Florida wave or Withville, Virginia, upstate New York, the Hudson Valley wave, the Belgium wave, huge wave in France in the 1950s. Every area has a giant wave at some point over it. And they're doing what amounts to a publicity campaign. And they're like going to show themselves. They're going to push. I mean, I just get, this is what the experiencers are saying as well, that at some point there will be open official disclosure, and the world is going to be very different, and not only, a social way, but in some fundamental ways, such as the raising of vibration or an influx of some type of energy, shifting into a higher dimension. This sort of thing has been said a lot, and whatever's coming up or whatever's going on with our planet involves this cover-up, involves open official disclosure, involves what seems to be some sort of fundamental change, and every ET from the galaxy seems to want to see it and are here in large numbers.
Here's a super chat question. I think it's a really good question too. I've actually never asked this or considered this, and I've of course, I've wondered it, but I've never asked a researcher such as yourself. This comes from ML. Any idea how ETs are born or reproduce?
What we don't have is a single account of, a pregnant gray. So we don't think that's how they produce. And in fact, we're pretty sure that they use a process of cloning, which hasn't been successful. And though their lifespan, by all accounts, is longer than ours, there are several reports of some very old grays who did reveal numbers that were in the hundreds, I believe. But yeah, it's a process of cloning, and for that matter, it appears to be that there's some, you could call them a parasitic race, because they're reproducing through us right now. And that seems to be one of their methods. But people are taken on board a UFO, and there they are, these little alien babies in tanks. And this is very common. I've got several of my own cases. Really, before Bud Hopkins even revealed it in his book Intruders, which pretty much clinched this agenda of hybridization. There's hundreds of accounts where people have seen these little tiny alien babies. One lady was told they can grow them up to human in 4 days. That's the only time I've heard that. To adult size.
4 days? 4 Earth days?
Yes. And what I also find interesting is the fact that many abductees, experiencers report having their genetic material removed. Mostly what people see is, grays, hybrid grays, and Nordics. But these Nordics, what if they're just us? What if that's our genetic material? Because there are reports of that as well, where ETs are saying, oh no, we're related. And say they look a little more genetically perfect. Well, it could be easy for these grays to, spruce things up a little bit. So, yeah, I think that we're dealing with someone who's got a much closer relationship to us than we realize. Then there's the praying mantis, though, and they seem to be the ones who are more in charge. So, and I don't know about them, where exactly they come from or what the deal is, but they're very intelligent.
Here's another question here. Jacob, I hope I said that right. Have any of you guys heard of Jim Andre, the man who was allegedly tattooed by EBEs?
I can't speak to that particular case, but tattooing type events are relatively common.
Really?
Oh, yeah. This
is the first I've ever heard of it.
Oh, no. The ETs will put marks on people. Often, you see a puncture wound or a scoop mark. That's different. No, this happened to, I believe, Whitley Strieber. He had a triangle marked on him. Zhao Buist, she's a California abductee, had a strange hieroglyphic mark put on him. This happened to another guy in
Now
Colorado.
you're not talking about, like, for instance, since I'm part of Yvonne's groups, she every time one of the people who are taken, I don't want to reveal any names of in the people who are anonymous in Zero, they share pictures of what happens to them, so they scoop marks or things like that. So there could be like 3 puncture marks that look like a triangle. You're not talking about made of, say, by like now a common theme amongst us is scarring as a way of, new tattoos, essentially. You know what I'm saying? If you
Right.
scar something into you for design, is that what you're mentioning, or you're talking about like with ink?
Right. No, not with ink. But that's the real question is this a design or is this like, a puncture wound due to an alien instrument? It appears in some cases, no, this is like a calling card, a tattoo, a mark on a person's body, which, has a sort of a design to it. Another good case occurred in Colorado. This gentleman is actually paralyzed, paraplegic. I forget to what rate he's paralyzed, but in a wheelchair, and had an experience where a mark appeared on his hip, and it was a really curious mark because it had like 2 lines and dots in this sort of weird formation, and clearly wasn't natural. It was by intelligent design, his instant thought, and I had no idea where it came from until he was in the shower and seeing this thing and looking at it when a memory flashed into his mind, or maybe he recalled it through a dream. No, I forget. At any rate, he remembered what happened. He was inside this room and there were these beings there. He doesn't really remember what they looked like, but they started unrolling his fingers, which were permanently balled up in fists, and actually like could not be stretched out unless through a heavy-duty splinting process. They just peeled his hands out and did the same with his legs, and seemed very curious about why he was not able to walk or why he hadn't been cured.
Wow.
It didn't cure him, by the way. Just put him back, and with that weird mark. So I don't know. It's strange. It's a pretty rare experience. Triangles.
That's common. Yeah, I've seen lots of pictures from Yvonne's group. It's like I don't know, 50 to 100 people in that email chat or email group, and like I said, constantly someone is usually every couple days at least someone's taken, and at least once a week some photo will circulate from a part of their body, and the most common that I've seen is either 3 marks that form in a triangle or a scoop mark that is a triangle.
Right. Yeah. Very common. I know, and it might be connected to implants. Can't say for sure. I think in one lady, she had this mark on her hand, which would fluoresce under black light, and doctors were like totally amazed by it. She feels that's an implant. I don't know. It's hard to say, but this marking phenomena is a real thing. Makes me wonder about the mark of the witch and
that's right.
Historical accounts and things like that.
The mark of the beast, right?
And things like that. But yeah, that does happen.
Here's a question from Nicholas Cashmore. What was the most memorable of John Mack's findings?
That's a pretty broad question. I'm going to say that he came away from his experiences. Gosh, it's a shame he passed away. I often wonder about that.
Yeah, I know. By hitting some drunk driver. And I don't even know if the driver was drunk. He just got hit by a car leaving a pub in the UK. I know I was speaking to someone about it recently. They said, well, it's because they drive on the other side. But yeah, I mean, I've been there a couple of times. I mean, you get used to it right away. I mean, you got to look both ways before you cross the road anyway. The drivers there are much more aggressive, but that's not to say I don't think John Mack was stupid enough to just walk in the road without looking both ways. So that is a very questionable way that he passed away, especially considering that Harvard did not like the fact that he was talking about this.
Right. He was becoming a very big influence in the field. Certainly, he was. And he is a Pulitzer Prize winner, a Harvard psychiatrist, very educated guy, and looked at this UFO phenomena, was one of the first real academics to do so. And his book, Abduction, made a huge splash. And I think he came away, his main conclusions were that this is not a nefarious phenomena, and its main purpose is to spiritually transform people. And that was really the theme I think he came away with, and certainly the theme of his book, Abduction, is that some of these people feel like these ETs are their family and have more allegiance to them than they do to the human race.
You know, one of the cases that he talked about that really got me, that I loved the most, was the Zimbabwe landing at the school.
Right. Absolutely. That's a very astonishing case, and one of several, of course. There's some very famous cases. I'm doing a whole research project on this right now, and it's amazing when I'm finding out. I don't want to talk about it too much because I haven't totally got my research complete. This is definitely going to be the subject of another book.
Putting all the landings, right? I would think the one in the Soviet Union that I read about, which happily, I was during an art project in 4th grade when they laid out newspapers. I just happened to get the part of LA Times which talked a little article about in the Soviet Union where it was a park and landing happened, and there was two beings. Like one was like a square, like robot type of being, and another one that I think was a typical gray. But that was one that really got me when I was young. Here's an interesting question for you. Jake, I really hope I'm saying the name right. Jacob, I hope that's right. Do you believe that this is the ET's final form because their ship seems to have changed throughout history according to the time period? For example, the flying boats, and presumably they may also have And let me add to that too, is that what about them lying? Because, in the late 1800s, I heard of the case where, Westerners would see a craft landed, and they would ask the ET, they thought it was like a new type of train. And the beings would respond that, oh, it's an air brake, new air brake system or something like that. And they would claim that they're on another part of this planet. So what do you say about this question?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think one of the curious facets about the UFO phenomena that has led people away from the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which I still support. I still think, in my assessment, I think it's the best explanation. But there's this weird thing. UFOs do seem to track cultures and have changed over the years. It started with weird airships in the 1890s and 1900s, which had propellers. They were very blimp-like. Some cases darted around. Some cases were silent, sometimes had motors. People heard foreign voices, saw human-looking figures. There were some landings. It was a huge wave of sightings. One of the first really decent recorded waves in modern history. And that was followed by the Foo Fighters, which is probably related to military technology in some way, in some cases, but apparently not all of them. They're little just balls of light. There was the Swedish ghost rockets. That was just around that time. And that's when we started to get the modern UFO reports of saucer-shaped objects. Now, there are saucer-shaped objects that go farther back, now that we've uncovered and done research for years and years. But as far as other countries, we're seeing pretty much the same types of craft. It's mostly saucer-shaped, or triangular-shaped, and spherical-shaped are the most common. And beyond that, there's lots of, glowing objects. Manta ray-shaped comes up quite a bit. Boomerang-shaped. Then you get sort of like weird shapes that are harder to categorize. But triangular is certainly very common these days. And it's pretty much stayed that way ever since. Some have colored lights, some don't. I'm not convinced the colored lights are sensors or anything. It seems like almost decoration, or perhaps used for hypnotizing people. I don't know. I'm really curious about that, their use of lights. But yeah, generally speaking, we see these metallic craft and they haven't changed that much. And 50 years, 70.
Let me throw this into the mix. What about the fact that they lie? 120 years ago, they said they're from another part of this planet.
Right.
70 years ago, they said they're within our solar system on Venus, Mars, right? And then we start to hear they're from Zeta Reticuli and other places. But then even now, it's almost coming back to form where I've even heard stories that the ETs, when asked where they're from, they say if they're from here, from Earth. And they say that to travel into space is to travel into time. And I thought that was really interesting. Of course, that was one, species or one person that got that question, that answered. But again, that they just lied about their origins, I would think, to protect us, to not scare us. But why?
Well, lying does happen. Certainly humans lie on a much greater scale, I think. ETs are not so much liars, generally, I'm saying. They're very tight-lipped. They're very coy with their answers. They'll say, you ask a question like, don't worry, everything's fine. They're not very forthcoming. The Zeta Reticuli map does appear to be legitimate, and the Zeta Reticuli has come up in a number of other cases, as has a number of other, Orion, Arcturus, Andromeda, certainly, which is another galaxy, so that's kind of strange. And you're right, they do lie. What's also very common is we're from Mars, we're from Venus, or we're from, beyond the moon. What is that supposed to mean? They're usually, you won't understand, it's not important, this sort of thing. So, yeah, I don't think they're flat out lying in a lot of cases. They do give prophecies that often come true, or sometimes certainly, and but do put on masquerades. They put on these masks, these screen memories. They're very evasive often, and a little bit manipulative and deceptive, certainly. So, gosh, I can see why some people be like, oh my gosh, that's exactly, demonic. No, it's not demonic. Just speaking towards that, because I certainly looked into it. I read all the books on ghosts and demonology and investigated my own cases up to, people being possessed in very dark spirits. And it's a completely different phenomena that manifests in a completely different way. We've charted how the UFO abduction experience goes, and we've charted how a demonic haunting goes. It's a completely different pattern. So just putting that out there. I still think we're dealing with ETs from other planets who are a little bit nervous about giving their origins.
Clearly, especially if we have their technology and are able to get there now. I'm talking about the unknown or the secret space programs. I'm not talking about the Corey Goods and then the Randy Kramers that are making the round in the circuits. I'm talking about the legit military astronauts. I mean, Edgar Mitchell told me before he passed away, and he didn't say this on an interview because we became, friends on the phone after doing over a dozen interviews. He told me that there was a lot more military astronauts than people thought. They actually did have a program. And other people even suggested that, and Edgar Mitchell wouldn't say yes or no that this happened on his missions or his mission, that on each civilian mission was placed a military astronaut that was already on board the spacecraft long before the parade of the civilian astronauts got on board.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, there's some information coming out right now about this whole secret space race and our relationship with ETs, which I think is also what's driving forth the disclosure movement. Because with all of that sort of information beginning to tip out, they can sort of release this other information and let us focus on old news instead of this really sensitive stuff that's going on right now. And yeah, I mean, they're abductees, for that matter, who report seeing military officials on board the UFO while they're being abducted. What's that?
Yes, and that opens the whole doors to military abductions, my labs. I've always really wondered about that because that's a small percentage of the cases of people being taken, right?
Yeah, most onboard cases don't appear to have military. My labs are a real thing. I don't think abductions is military caused. I really don't. There's way too many of them going on for far too long, and what people are seeing is far beyond anything the military has, for sure. But my labs do happen, and there is some deception there. There is a mind control problem in our society in terms of, if you want to get into conspiracies. I think that's one of them that does have validity behind it, and it is a problem because they can hypnotize a person and make them think that they've been abducted by aliens. And this has caused some researchers to really think abductions, perhaps a good number of them, are my labs. I'd say a small number of them are. And I evidence that because what happens is you have people getting abducted, and then the military shows up and starts questioning them and wants to know what happened. Well, if they were the ones doing it, they wouldn't need to do that.
That opens the whole door to also Men in Black. I remember having a guest on, and he gave me 4 recordings of what allegedly were Men in Black. These recordings were weird. If anyone remembers that show, it's archived somewhere on my YouTube, and I have these files on here if anyone was interested in hearing them. But unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to, Preston, because you're on the other side of the program that I'm running. But regardless, what do you think about Men in Black? Some people claim that there are ET in nature, but they're wearing humans' bodies or like skins almost as as clothing, where other people say it's a separate unit within the military or the whatever you want to call it, the cabal, that is humans and is just there to protect them.
Yeah, it's a very strange phenomenon, and I think there's sort of a confusion when people talk about Men in Black because people think, oh, the government agents. Yeah, that does happen, and those aren't really the true Men in Black that we're talking about here. Because what we have is a situation where there are these human-looking figures that have oddities about them. Their skin is way too white. Their behavior is way off. Their eyes look strange. They look identical. They drive these black Cadillacs or black vehicles, wear these suits, and have a very threatening manner about them. And what's most remarkable is these guys show up when nobody told anyone about what happened. So they have this way of sensing a UFO event where someone gets physical evidence, say a photograph or an artifact, and they're there right after it happens. I know one good example is that case I was telling you earlier from Constance Clear about the man who had a healing of kidney stones, and there was the female gray who says, what's mad, what's hell?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
That female ET gave this man an artifact, an alien artifact. She says, this is our gift to you for having gone through what you did. And she held up this metallic object, an iron, little tiny, couple inches long iron bar. And she says, you'll find it if we decide to give it to you. Well, he did. He found it on his dresser one morning and immediately recognized it, grabbed it. He already had scheduled a hypnotic appointment with Constance Clear that morning, right? So nobody knew he had it. He just grabs it, rushes off to Constance Clear's office, and is pulled over, run off the road by Men in Black, who pull him out of his car, take all his stuff, threaten him really badly. He's like, I'm a human, I'm a U.S. citizen. You can't do this. I'm going to go to the police. They're like, go ahead. They don't even know we exist. And threatened him not to talk at all about his experiences or keep seeing the therapist that he was seeing. And that's a typical case where whenever someone gets really good evidence, they take it away.
One thing about the Men in Black is one of the guests that I had on that brought me these recordings, who did a little bit, the more of a study than anyone else that I've found, and it was only a handful of cases, but he said that, for instance, that famous hotel case where you see the video footage of it, he said that the valet drivers did not even recognize the car. Weird anomalies like that. What are we creating a different car for them? I mean, is Ford and GM having a separate car just for the government that is unrecognizable, has no marks whatsoever? It just doesn't make sense. Certain things don't make sense. Anyhow, let me get to some more questions here. Okay, back to Nicholas Cashmore's question. What do the native Indians say about the space/star people?
They take a very benevolent viewpoint. I've spoken with a number of them. Artie Six Killer Clark has done a two or three book series on them, and by and large, the encounters are very benevolent. The guy I spoke with, Stan Hughes, I did a chapter on him in my book, Inside UFOs, is a blood Indian. He prefers to be called Indian, not Native American, for whatever reason. He's from Canada, the Seneca tribe. His name is Man Seeking His People. He calls the extraterrestrials the Wojay, which means star people. And he and their culture feels that they are ancestors. They're related. And he's had a number of very benevolent experiences. He would often go up to Lake Pend Oreille in the Idaho Panhandle with his family and watch what he called nocturnal lights flying over the lake and putting on these little shows for the people. And one time they're doing that, and they're really out there. They're zinging. There's a bunch of them, and one of them comes swooping down to eye level. They're overlooking, on a bluff on the lake. It's at eye level now and very close. And Stan's little daughter says, "Daddy, Daddy, they're talking to me." And he's like, "Oh my God," and she's like, "What do I say? What do I say?" And he says, "Well, tell them you love them." So in her sweet little voice, she says, "I love you." And at that point, this UFO flares up real brightly, comes right towards them, swoops down even a little bit more, right over their heads, and takes off. And they all felt like, wow, it said hello. And that's sort of a typical encounter, sighting-wise, that this guy has had. He had another encounter where this object showed up and he kept getting close, and he'd feel this real strong fear. And it did it over and over again to the point where he's like, it's trying to warn me of something. When he got home, later he found out that his son was having an emotional crisis. Another time they did a Native American healing ceremony, and afterwards a UFO showed up right over the trees in celebration. The whole group there thought, their little tribe. But his best encounter, he's driving along the road in his pickup at the base of Thunder Mountain early one morning with his dog sitting in the front seat, when a UFO drops out of the sky and sits in front of the road. It's a huge silver sphere, chrome-like, like a mirror, beautiful, and an opening appears, and out steps a Nordic-looking ET. And when I say Nordic, I mean human-looking. He actually
blonde, blue eyes, muscle, right? Perfect.
No, he was very muscular, very perfect, but was not blonde. He was actually Middle Eastern-looking.
Interesting.
Perhaps. Right, which does happen just as often as the so-called blonde. That's why I don't like the term Nordic. I think it's misleading. It's all types of races of so-called Nordics.
Yeah,
right.
It's just advanced humans, right? Us to be, if we were as perfect as can be, if we ate the proper foods we ate and we exercised the proper way, and
exactly.
Over time, I mean, I don't want to say anything bad, but if you look at movies from like the 20s and the 10s and the 30s, I gotta say, people were uglier back then. I mean, I'm not trying to make anything bad, but our population as a whole, all over this planet, has gotten more beautiful over time. I've made that observation. I'm like, wow, just look at all these movies. Look in the Three Stooges, right? Not just the Three Stooges, but all the other characters that they come into play with. You really don't see that as the average man and the average woman nowadays. And I'm not talking about the makeup and the hair and so on and the clothing. I'm talking about their faces. So it seems like genetically we've all gotten better.
Well, perhaps you're right. There's some evidence that ETs are genetically mutating us not mutating, but you know what I mean, affecting generation upon generation. So perhaps that's a possibility. I always kind of attribute it to a fat obsession with beauty and that's being what's plastered all over the media.
That's
I don't know.
true. I mean, that's true too. But I'm talking about the underlying. When you look at natural beauty overall, you know, you
Right.
just don't really see. You see more of it than what you saw, say, 100 years ago.
That
Anyway.
would be an interesting story. Well, let me finish this story
Oh,
quick.
absolutely, yes.
You know, the UFO lands in front of Stan's truck. You know, his dog doesn't notice a thing. He feels a weird, sedated calm come over him. A door opens. Out steps this Nordic being with dark skin, Middle Eastern features, shoulder-length hair, wearing a blue jumpsuit and silver boots. And Stan's like, this is the most handsome man I've ever seen. He was just handsome, handsome, handsome. Mind you, he's married with kids, but just going on with that. And this being steps forward in front of his car and is smiling, and they're locked gazes. And Stan is just overcome with feeling. He says, take me with you. And the man's smile drops, and he's like, no, I can't. Turns around, goes back into the craft, which takes off. It's a really remarkable, positive encounter. And that's pretty typical of a lot of Native American encounters.
You know, it's actually interesting. You said the dog didn't even, recognize or react.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, I know someone who saw Grays close up walking down the street. She was with her dog, and her dog didn't react at all. Not that she noticed. Actually, she was looking at the Grays.
Now they're uglier. And that's different. Now they're definitely ugly beings. That's for darn sure. But I'm when compared to these other ones, the Nordics, as you mentioned, George Adamski, other people who have come in contact with the human-looking ones, they're always just super beautiful. The woman and the men just as perfect as can be.
Yeah, and for that matter, people often describe the Greys as beautiful too, looking very elegant and with a certain grace about them, and especially the hybrids. And it's funny because I'm thinking, well, let's look at the inside of UFOs. Is there any artwork? Is there music? Where's the culture? And we don't see a lot of that, but there is, traces of it certainly. Like pastel colors are fairly common. And there's absolutely an aesthetic nature to their instruments, the tables that come out of the walls themselves. Their costumes are generally featureless, their clothes, but do occasionally have emblems, and there are symbols as well. But we don't see, artwork on the walls, and we don't generally hear music playing.
And that begs a question, right? We have all this amazing, and by the way, for Rolf Pfeiffer Muller, I'm going to get to your question, and let me give a shout out to you. By the way, I did get your links. Music, art, right? These are fantastic creations we have, and especially when you think of some of the music like EDM, electronic dance music, that has no lyrics. That is true universal music. It doesn't matter what culture you are, because it has no lyrics, you're able to relate to it. Same thing with classical music, right? It's just universally amazing. And the artwork. Why, don't people report any of this? And you're right, I've never ever heard anyone talk about seeing a portrait of a painting or music on board a ship while waiting to being operated, like in a hospital or something like that, or an elevator. Nothing, absolutely nothing.
It's very strange that they do have some sense of fashion, certainly. There are gowns and robes and hoods and things like that. But makeup does not seem to be a thing. Music, I will say in regards to that there are some cases with tones being emitted from a craft which have a very vibrational quality to them, or musical quality. And some, nothing really quite like Close Encounters, but a couple. There was one lady in New Mexico who heard, she said, it sounded like one of those calculators that you go do 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 do.
David Sarita does, he did a big study on tones, and he's actually found out the frequency and, of what the pyramids and certain things like that, and he's able to play them, and they actually sound, like you said, pretty amazing.
Yeah, but there's no, rock songs on
No, nothing like that.
And this is the Greys I'm speaking about mostly. And, as far as Nordics though, for certainly praying mantis, you don't hear them singing,
Yeah.
singing or anything like that. And their language, they do sometimes speak verbally. Greys have a high-pitched, sort of warbling language, very squeaky, and the praying mantis is very chattery. The Greys, yeah, Betty Andreasen has heard them speak. The guy a couple of people I've talked to.
Clifford Stone, as mentioned, on the 12 crashes, when he's came in contact with the ones that do speak, it described sounds just like you mentioned of the little ones that he called the little guy, small gray-looking being, and he said it was very like squeaky sort of noises.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, one lady I'm like, well, what do they sound like? She's like, wee 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 wee. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I asked, Kevin Cameron, I'm like, because they were talking to him in English and telepathically, and they told him the name of their planet and what they were called. And I'm like, well, what was it? And he says, I can't tell you. And I forced him into a corner. I'm like, just tell me. He says, it was it. He says there were lots of Z's and T's. Or something. He couldn't really tell. It's very interesting. I've heard a number of people give the Greys names, or the Greys have given their names out. Betty Andreasen certainly talked to this ET named Quasga. Bill Hamilton had an experience with a Grey who called himself Qualar. One lady I interviewed said that ET told her his name was Quai. Another lady was told by the Grey ET his name was Sen, S-E-N. So they do have names. That's something. It's like not a number. Hey, I'm X329.
I actually heard, that some their names are not verbal, but they're actually more like projections of vibrating light of different. What's the proper word I'm looking for? Symbols. That's what their names are. They're basically symbols that I haven't heard that person say they were pronounced, but that's what when he asked, what are your names? And that's what the ETs responded. He says, well, you wouldn't really understand it, but here it is. And out comes this projection of this pulsating symbol.
Right. Well, we do that too. We all have our own symbol for our name. And one lady, she's like, well, what do I call you? What do I call you? And he's like, you can call me Kevin. I'm like, oh, that's a Grey, by the way.
Definitely, obviously, it sounds like it's taken from us. Unless, hey, what's to say that maybe we got the names from them?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I find it interesting that a number of them names start with Q, at least that I've heard, and some are like Xeno. That was one name, which is xenophobic. I mean, come on.
Yeah, of course.
That doesn't that's clearly generated. It's interesting for. Mostly, Greys don't offer their names up, and they don't wear name tags. But they do have symbols on their little uniforms, and one common one is the winged serpent, the phoenix. That happened to Betty Andreasen, happened to Jim Sparks, all other sort of weird, like, insignia on their uniforms, which I find interesting, perhaps indicating rank or group.
True, very true. Okay, let me get back to some of these questions. Royal Pfeiffer Muller's question: are you aware of the essays of Michael Topper, and his essays regarding that which relate to in his books? And do you know Laura Jadzik and her husband Arcadius Works? I think it's what it's pronounced.
I'm gonna have to say.
Or you know what I'll do? I'll copy and I'll paste this for you. Maybe you can actually. Just read this question on your own, and we'll get back to that one. Okay, let me read you the next one while I figure out a way to get you this question for you to read. You'll be able to see it because it's in all caps from the screenshot I'm sending you. Okay, let me get to the next one here that I'm looking for. Jacob, if their ships have changed throughout history, is it possible that the ETs themselves have been changing their physical makeup as well?
It's a great question. And we're not really seeing that. In my own cases, and I think this is borne out by other researchers, we're seeing primarily some version of the Greys, 50, 60, 70%, And by that, there's a variety of grays, and they're not changing all that much. Well, I'm going to speak. I'm going to change my mind a little bit here because that's a great question. I haven't been asked that before. We do seem to be having, these hybrid phenomena, and a more human-like trend towards ETs. But there's such a catch-all category out there of unique-looking ETs that it becomes really almost impossible to categorize these guys. You've got short, tiny little humanoids, some with beady little eyes, some with big eyes, some with hair, some without hair. Some have, different colored skin. They get all taller and taller, all the way up to literally, 9, 10, 11 feet in outlying cases.
Well, I remember you talked about that praying mantis that the woman saw on the street. Maybe it was Chicago. That was like, what, 25 foot tall?
15 feet tall.
Wow. That's astonishing.
Yeah, I think that's a little hard to even imagine. I mean, we don't have really big feet cases that reach that height. And she was able to estimate it, as was the other witness I have who saw it, because he's a trained observer, a medic, a Navy medic. He says this is well taller than a basketball hoop, and the board. And she saw this thing in O'Fallon, Illinois, around the time of the Chicago O'Hare incident, by the way. Lives next to Air Force Base there. I forget what it's called. Scott or something like that. At any rate, she likes to jog early in the morning, 4:30, when it's still dark and there are no cars, and sees this stick man walking down the road. She thought it was a guy on stilts until, she immediately realized it wasn't. She's not far away from it when it walks under the street light, and she can see it perfectly. It is a praying mantis with really long, bony legs. It's taking 10-foot strides at a very brisk pace, face down towards the ground, looking for something. It's swinging back and forth. She gives a very good description of this thing as it moves out of the spotlight there and off down the road and turns into the cornfield. But yeah, I mean, this thing was 15 feet tall, and she could tell because it was right next to this street light there.
And so she had a reference point. I also, by the way, if you check your personal Skype in the messages, not the group one, you'll be able to see that question I did send you if you want to take a look at it. And when you tell me you can read it, we can answer that. But in the meantime, here's another one for you. How many space people are coming to Earth?
Yeah, these are great questions. I was talking about this with, who was it? One of the main researchers. I can't remember who it was. I've been talking to so many people these days. But yeah, I'm like, I was telling him, I think the Greys are probably more numerous than us. We've got 7 billion, and he instantly agreed. And I say that because how worldwide this phenomena is and how pervasive it is and how many people are reporting this experience. If we have New Fork and MUFON getting dozens of cases per day, and only one person in 10 or 100 reports their cases, so we're talking 100, 1,000 cases per day, which means right now someone's being abducted. Right now, many people are being abducted. Many people are seeing UFOs right now. They are out there in large numbers. It's a very large universe. So when you say how many ETs are out there, well, it's practically infinite. How many are visiting Earth? According to some sources, Paul Hellyer mentioned like 50 races, I think, or
well, Clifford Stone said 57, right? And then I've heard estimates later be 250, and then even Clifford Stone recently, 57, that was in the 80s. But recently, it's an ongoing... he said it's up to 400 and probably more.
Yeah, first I'll get an orange-haired alien case, and then a small, dark-skinned, round-eyed dwarf case, and then a hairy dwarf, and then a light being, and a gray, and a slightly taller gray, and then a slightly shorter gray, a wide variety of grays, which might be completely different things. So it's really hard to categorize these things and say, are they changing? Are they evolving? Humanity is evolving, but like you said, maybe we're getting better looking. We are certainly getting taller on the average. We know that for sure.
Yeah, that's another observation as I had when I was watching old movies. Particularly, I love Three Stooges, right? So that was the reference point. But then I really went looking into all the old movies. And if you think about it, the movie agencies, what were they looking for even 100 years ago? They're looking for pretty women and handsome men, right? Look at Clark Gable and whoever else was popular, say 100 years ago, Gone with the Wind. And that's what I based on the fact that we as a whole society have gotten more beautiful without the makeup, without the fashion and all that. That's where I base that on. Here's a question that is really amazing because I would really like to have this experience myself. This is from Kai Smith. Has anyone reported being taken to other planets and remembering what they saw?
Yes, absolutely. And I've talked to some of these people, and some I'm like, not sure I believe. But there are a number, and it's like one guy, he's a Native American, said, yeah, it was another planet, and it was very much like ours, only the vegetation was different. Several people have talked about being taken to where the Greys are, and they live in these sort of adobe-like huts, which are surprisingly primitive looking. So there's that. I don't have any really good cases personally that I'm like, wow, this is another planet. But this does happen fairly regularly. I believe that hunter from Rawlins, Wyoming, who was abducted, what is his name? I forget it. But he reported that. He was taken in. Carl Higdon, that's right. Carl Higdon was a hunter out hunting elk in Wyoming and saw this weird-looking ET, human but not, was taken into a 10-foot wide craft that was very big on the inside, much more massive than 10 feet, certainly, and saw elk there in glass cages and was taken to another planet and saw weird buildings and all this. There's another case like that in Japan, I believe it was. They described very strange buildings and weird architecture. So yeah, it does happen. I find it fascinating because people are like taken into UFOs, and often they can walk around. There's a sort of a normal gravity. Usually they can breathe. It's sometimes difficult. People do describe it as being stuffy sometimes, or like thin air or thick, different. And sometimes people are floated through a craft, but generally speaking, the gravity seems to be Earth normal.
Really? That's interesting because, I would think definitely, as you mentioned, the air being thicker or thinner, that I would expect. But I would think that, the gravity would be maybe sometimes 120% of Earth's gravity or 80% of Earth's gravity, things like that. I never would have thought it would have been really close to ours. Maybe it would be something drastically different, like the moon.
Yeah, we don't really know, but I'm looking at the accounts, trying to be objective about it, and people are sitting there on the table. They're walking across the room, and people are sitting on benches, and so on. And the Greys are walking around, and it's no one reports like, hey, I can make huge leaps and bounds inside the UFO, or they can fly. No, that's not what people are reporting. And they're not reporting like I'm pressed to the ground or anything and I can't move. From a gravitational point of view, they do report being paralyzed, of course.
Yeah, that's for sure. That I've heard a lot, but I've always wondered what they, were their homes like. And it's amazing that you mentioned that the Greys have like primitive adobe-like structures. But then again, like with Richard Shaw's statement of the fact that they must live like rats or roaches because they're just crammed. I guess it doesn't really surprise me that much, but at the same time, I don't know. I think anything would surprise me. Any planet that has any structures on it. So I guess it's only as far as our imagination can be until we're actually taken ourselves.
Yeah. Well, one guy told me they don't live on the planet. They have a ship, and he would have nightly experiences, and he had his own room, and it was very sparse. There was a bed, and that was about it. A chair, and a bathroom, which was like ours but much more advanced. Didn't use water or anything. It's just he wasn't really able to clearly describe it, how it worked, but it was able to take care of business, so to speak.
Yeah, right. Okay, here is Roll Five for Muller's other question. By the way, if you're able to find that I sent you, let me know.
Yeah, I found it, but I can't speak to that. I don't have any information on that.
Okay, no problem. Here's his other question. Has you or other individuals experienced sleep catalepsis or other cataplexy?
Catalepsy.
Yeah, prior to external appropriation.
External appropriation. Yeah, that's a good way of saying, being taken or lifted or whatever. There's various terminologies people use within the UFO community. Yeah, I've certainly studied it, and I've absolutely experienced it. And sleep paralysis, it's often called, is a very interesting phenomenon, which is a natural phenomena caused by the sleeping brain, which emits a chemical that basically paralyzes the human beings so they don't sleepwalk and act out their dreams. And people, who do sleepwalk and have problems with it, have a disorder where they don't produce sufficient amounts of this chemical. And what happens is people wake up when this happens and can't move. And sometimes you're kept in sort of this hypnagogic half-sleep state. And this is sort of a precursor of like when you have an out-of-body experience or a lucid dream. It feels like there are people all around you, and you can hear voices and all kinds of noises, and so it can be very confusing, and people think, it's a visitation. It's not, but it can mimic some of the symptoms of it. And some people have tried to explain away abductions as sleep paralysis, and that's just ludicrous, because there's so many reasons why it doesn't explain it, from landing traces to scars in the body to healing cases to radar returns to multiple witness and blah, blah, blah. But it does have some similarities, and it's a very scary phenomenon when it does happen to people, because, it feels like there are people around you, and you can't see them. Sometimes
I wanted to say, for anyone listening, since we are running out of time, if you have any final questions, I want to be able to wrap them up, because I wish I could keep Preston all night, but he does have to go at some point. So let me get to another one here, and I think this might be the last one unless any more come in the next minute or so. I'll put it to another minute or so. This is from Black Dog. Implant doses he knows anyone with them?
Oh, do I? Oh my gosh, that's not, I'd say pretty much, well, I don't want to say all, but certainly the majority of researchers do. Turns up very regularly. Often, the people I've interviewed will go to a dentist or a doctor as a result of, say, tripping or having some problem or whatever, and the doctor's like, well, that's weird. You've got this object in your septum, or what? Why do you have scarring in your ear? Did you stick a pencil in your ear, or did you shove a pencil up your nose? One guy had an implant under his molar in his mouth, and the doctor's like, did you shoot a BB gun into your mouth? Even though this object was way larger than a BB. I've seen the x-rays of it. And
see, that's weird, because you mentioned tooth, right? I immediately think, 60s KGB or CIA.
Yeah, there's no entry wound here, though. It's below the tooth. The tooth is fine. There's no way it could be there. It completely freaked the dentist out. Freaked out the whole dental office where this happened. I've shown these x-rays to 2 medical professionals, and both diagnosed it as a foreign body, and both asked the same question, could it possibly have shot themselves in the mouth? I'm like, there's no entry wound. And there's no pain, by the way, either. And it just appeared after a UFO sighting, because they'd taken regular dental x-rays and had a close-up UFO sighting, went to the dentist, as you do every couple of years, you get x-rays. And lo and behold, there's this object. And I think, these are called implants. We don't know the purpose of them because we haven't been able to get these implants into the public arena. There have been a number of them removed by Dr. Lear, as you know.
Yeah, and unfortunately, most have disappeared, and I know the Lear family only has one left. After his death, it seemed that people literally scattered to grab his works, and that's a shame. That's really a huge shame and a disservice to the community.
Yeah, this is smoking gun evidence. He was really the go-to guy. There are other people looking into it. This is amazing evidence, because these have been analyzed, and we've gotten some results. Some are magnetic, some are emitting electromagnetic signals. A
That
number
are
of them.
that I remember the 17th removal he did, and it was financed by Richard Shaw, as you know, when he did in the Watchers series. And when they analyzed it, it was actually emitting emitting that, what was it, radio or frequencies that were consistent with deep space. Something in deep space was receiving these signals.
See, it's astonishing. A lot of them look exactly alike. The number of people can attribute their implants to a specific onboard UFO event. But here's what I find interesting, because we don't know exactly what they are. We've often thought they're for tracking or for mind control. It's been theories I've often heard thrown around. But I have to say I've talked to a number of abductees and certainly read this a number of times, that the purpose of the implant is generally related to health. One lady was told it was to measure the level of pollution. Another was told it was to measure her vitals. Another was told it was to boost the immune system. So these are the things I think we're looking at. Certainly, there's reports of the workers at Area 51 being implanted to boost their health to the point where they're, defying age.
Wow.
And
Interesting. And that would make sense, especially if to boost not just their health to defy, age, but also maybe to be able to sustain some of the, I don't know, whether it be radiation or other things that are emitting from some of these craft or objects that they're dealing with that are non-terrestrial in nature.
exactly, yeah. And so some people take a very positive viewpoint towards having an implant. Others, not so much.
Here's the final question I'm going to take in the chat because we do have to go. And comes from Common Sense to Me. What was your most memorable case?
People always ask me this, and it's so hard to answer that one. Probably a real, one favorite case that keeps coming to mind is not really even an on-board case, a face-to-face ET case, but I keep thinking about it because it's just such an astonishing incident. It occurred to Ray Sachs, an electrician's mate on the USS Clamagore, a sub with nuclear missiles. Back in 1971, was heading up the East Coast at about 12 knots on the surface of the ocean, and he was a lookout with another petty officer. The captain was there, as was the second in command, when a USO shows up and starts pacing the submarine right off the side there for a good 15 minutes. It was huge. It was right underwater. They couldn't tell how big it was or quite how big it was, but it was very bright. And all the high-ranking officers came out on deck one by one, took a look at it, and I don't know, wow, and went back below until finally this thing came in at 100 knots, takes off at like 80 knots in another direction, and the second in command turns to the commander and says, "Captain, how do you want me to report this in the log?" And the captain says, "Officers who report this sort of thing do not move up in rank." And so apparently it wasn't recorded. At the time, Ray and the other watchout were talking about it, just jibber-jabbering and going on, and the second in command turns to them and says, "Will you shut up?" and so, "Don't talk about this and don't tell anyone." Well, of course, Ray Sachs goes below, and he is mobbed by every single crewman and wants to know what they saw because it was a huge buzz all over the ship. And he contacted me because he's elderly, retired, and doesn't want this story to be lost to history. It's an amazing story.
Well, that is actually a very good point that you mentioned, that we don't want cases to be lost in history. I really hope people out there who are aging that may have been harboring secrets, especially those who have been working for government projects that maybe are too afraid to talk at this point, especially people who were involved in crash and retrievals. I'd like to make a global announcement. Please come forth, please. The more numbers, the better. The more cases, the better. In Preston's books, especially the one that really got me super, I don't want to say motivated, it's the wrong word because I was already there, but expanded my knowledge to holy crap, there's so much more going on when I read UFOs over California. all the crash retrieval cases. I don't think we'd be able to get some of these cases, Preston. Like, for instance, the one that I recall where this couple was watching on television and they see a crash and it's the disc is stuck in the sand and, tilting out sideways or a diagonal. And the reporter is saying that they're taking care of the little being at a hospital in San Diego, and then boom, the broadcast cuts out. Things like that happened, say, 60, 70 years ago that would have been lost had they not come to you.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I wrote that series of books, is because it is being lost. There's a lot of really old literature that is falling into, history and not being recorded. Thank God, there's a lot of people are writing books about various states. The subject is being taken more seriously. I take it very seriously. Even people who don't believe in UFOs and say, it doesn't affect me. Well, I got news for you. It does. This subject is having a profound effect on society. This technology is being covered up. These UFO crashes are real. They're much more common than people realize. California's got a bunch of its own cases. Several Air Force bases across the United States, many have been deeply implicated in this phenomena. It's not just Wright-Patterson and Edwards and Area 51. There's a lot of them. So I think what we're looking at is a situation where this technology is being bled out slowly, as is the whole cover-up, and the information is slowly, being released on a very controlled basis, and it's being accelerated due to the fact that we're having so many environmental problems. And I don't know. We'll see what rolls out coming forward, but I'm pretty excited about it. I'm pretty hopeful.
Well, I love how you are such an amazing researcher, and I really hope you do continue your UFOs over, so-and-so state series, because I would like to see, UFOs over America at one point. I mean, I'm sure that would be a entire library long. Maybe you can get some help from some other people in some other states that can sort of pick up on their states, like Wisconsin or something like that, so you don't have to carry it. Like you even mentioned, UFOs over Texas. That would be a hell of a book. Maybe volume 1, 2, and 3, or 4, or 5, even at that matter. But beyond that, let me say I'm happy that you are around and live close to me, and you're a close friend that could always call and talk about this stuff and bring on this show. With that being said, Preston, it's always fantastic to have you on. We will definitely have you on soon. You are one of the people that I bring back a lot sooner than later. Normally I wait 3 to 6 months for people. You are somebody that I bring about usually at least every 6 weeks to 8 weeks, because you have so much information and we barely get to touch on it. With that being said, now I'd like you to plug some information in about you, where people can find your books, your website, and stuff like that.
Yeah, gee, thanks. Yeah, shoot, we didn't even get to talk about some of the new information I have, but next time.
Yeah,
for sure.
See, that's what happens. We start one way and it goes another way.
But yeah, I mean, if you want to reach me, certainly you can just Google my name. It'll take you to my website, PrestonDennett.weebly.com. That's 2 N's, 2 T's. And all my books are there, excerpts. My email's there. Always love hearing from people, whether they've got a question or a comment or a story to share, especially, yeah. And of course, you can get my books at Amazon or Barnes & Noble and other online retailers, or at a bookstore near you, if you can find one. And thanks for having me on the show, Dr. J. You know how much I love it.
It's always a pleasure. And let me make a couple announcements. I will actually be a guest on a show tomorrow, which is at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, for a UFO panel on Broadcast Team Alpha, which is another YouTube channel if you folks want to check it out. Thursday, we have 2 guests. Peter Davenport, as you mentioned, New Fork earlier in the show, which I thought was ironic, Preston, because he's going to be on the first hour and Joe Montaldo the second hour. Now, I am working on something, folks, for Thursday, but it's going to be early morning. If this goes through, chances are it'll be 8 a.m. Pacific and 11 p.m. Eastern. Keep that in mind. If that works out, you'll see it on my website, and I'll promote it because it's going to be something that I've been working on for 7 years. And Friday, for a whopping 20 minutes, I get something. I can't really say who it is yet, but I'll give you a clue. It has to do. It's not Tom DeLonge, but it's somebody from the To the Stars Academy. And also remember, folks, the only thing you have to remember with the show is the name of it, Dr. J Radio Live. That is DRJ Radio Live. Everything you want to know from the website, Minds, Patreon, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, you name it. If you could think of anything that has an account, chances are I've taken that name for obvious reasons. And I have them all posted up here if you're watching it on YouTube. And also, let me give a shout out to Pam Vredenberg. She is my social media manager, and please check out her website, UnitedTruthSeekers.com. And she runs 25 Facebook groups, and she's a huge Facebook presence and is very involved and has been involved years for truth seekers and knows a lot of great people, and on her website has a lot of great information too. And also I want to thank Joe Montaldo, station owner, who happens to be the Hour 2 guest of Thursday at the same time, this show. And also I want to thank JC of Deprogrammed Radio in the UK. And of course we have to thank iHeartRadio because they are corporate owned. With that being said, folks, it's time for me to sign off.